America is home to 33 million small businesses, the beating heart of communities across the country.
And proof that the American dream is still alive.
This is a show about those dreamers and doers and the communities they serve.
Their real life stories.
Their struggles and successes.
Their grit, determination, and passion.
And the people who fight
to keep their American dream alive.
I'm Alfredo Ortiz.
I'm Elaine Parker.
And it's time for another episode of Main Street Matters,
America's small business megaphone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Main Street Matters, America's small business megaphone. I'm Jordan Bruno, Vice President of Job Creators Network.
And I'm Toni Angelini, Senior Vice President of Job Creators Network, Operations and Advocacy.
Please subscribe to the show at SalemPodcastNetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Today we're joined by Michigan State Representative Bill Schuette. He's joining us to discuss Michigan's labor laws, including their onerous new tipped minimum wage, and paid sick leave. Bill, thanks a lot for joining us.
Hey, really appreciate the opportunity to be on the podcast. Thanks for having me.
Bill, give our listeners a lay of the land of what's going on in Michigan. What are the labor laws and how it's affecting small businesses in your state?
Yeah, so small businesses in the state of Michigan are really facing what is a looming cliff, a freight train bearing down on them that will, come into effect on February 21st. And that's because our far left liberal Supreme Court issued a ruling that basically would put in place an elimination of the tipped wage in the state of Michigan and would put a top-down, one-size-fits-all sort of earned sick time policy on every small business and business period, everyone who employs more than one person in the state of Michigan. So it's really unworkable. We heard testimony all of last week from small businesses from every corner of both of our peninsulas talking about how difficult it would be, about restaurant workers realizing how this would rob them of their tips. And it's an important issue that the legislature needs to solve before February 21st.
A lot of us who work on Main Street or who are involved in policy understand the tipped minimum wage. We deal with it day to day. But when I talk about it to just regular folks, a lot of them don't understand what the tipped minimum wage is. Can you just give us a little background on the tipped minimum wage and why it's so important?
Absolutely. And that's why it's important to do podcasts like this. So I appreciate you having me on here. So right now in the state of Michigan, we have what is called the tip credit. So if you're a restaurant worker, if it's a slow day, you don't have somebody a lot of people come into your establishment, you'll still receive what is our statutory minimum wage in the state of Michigan. But your employer is also allowed to provide you with a tip credit, which in the state of Michigan right now is pay you 39% of minimum wage. And then you make that up in your additional tipped earnings that you get. And so it's a great deal for restaurant workers and for the restaurant owner alike. The restaurant owner doesn't have to process as much payroll, and then the restaurant worker gets to make a lot of money on tips. We heard from a server at a Buffalo Wild Wings in Michigan come in and testify in front of the committee that I chair. What she said, I've never had a day where I've made less than $30 an hour because of the tipped wage that she earns, and that she's a single mother, helps her pay her grocery bills, put her kids through private school. I mean, it's a huge win-win, and leave it to again a far left activist groups to try to eliminate such a common sense policy.
It's interesting. Our Job Creators Network was founded by Bernie Marcus, and he always attributed his success to being able to speak to his employees, not about which way to vote, but about how public policy would impact their paycheck. So, if it was something like minimum wage, he would go to these town halls and say to people like, sure, we can raise the minimum wage, but right now you work 20 hours a week. I'm only going to be able to afford to give you 3 hours a week. So, so he was able to really distill things down to people so that they could understand the impact that it was going to have, ultimately, on their lives. what are you hearing from the left? Just out of curiosity, other than small business owners are terrible and stealing from everybody. Like, what is their motivation for even trying to implement this in the first place?
Yeah. So again, I chair Michigan's Select Committee on Protecting Michigan Employees and Small Businesses, and we heard testimony last week on these issues, and we heard more than 4 hours of testimony, and it was really powerful from restaurant workers and single moms that said we rely on the tip credit to pay our bills and provide for our families, to 911 dispatchers talking about how an unworkable sick time policy will imperil the emergency services that we provide. We also did hear from some of these far left activist groups that are trying to push this policy. I found it very ironic that the group One Fair Wage that is pushing this change in Michigan is headquartered in California. Their president is in California. All their activists are in California. So not in Michigan. It's a California solution to a problem that doesn't exist. And what they basically said is, restaurant workers, this is actually a great deal for you. You'll still get all your tips, and then you'll also get a higher minimum wage. That is what they're claiming. But we've seen the evidence. We've seen One Fair Wage effectively enacted this policy in Chicago, the District of Columbia. And that just absolutely shuttered many restaurants, led to fewer jobs, lower tips. And then that's part of the reason why a similar ballot initiative was defeated in the state of Massachusetts, not exactly a conservative mecca. So I think the question that we then asked these, in committee says, so then who's going to pay for the minimum wage on top of the tip credit? And it ends up being you and me. It ends up being people who are going into restaurants. And that means you're paying, instead of, $15 for your meal, you're paying $25, and you're getting a service fee tacked on top of that. So maybe if you're George Soros, you can, afford all these bills and going out to eat. But mom and pop on Main Street are going to have a hard time making ends meet with that type of economic agenda.
Well, and you couple that with inflation and, the exorbitant price of food that we're all facing, now you're just piling on, extra costs on top of extra costs. Pivoting back to this, I think you described it as sort of more less sick leave, more sort of like a universal paid leave proposal. What does that look like for the employer? So, what are sort of the rules and regulations that they would be bound by if this unfortunately was to be passed?
Well, it's frankly, it's unworkable if you're an employer, and it's on everyone who employs more than one person. So there's no carve out for small businesses. So whether you're, General Motors with a multi-million-dollar HR department, or your, mom and pop corner store that's trying to, balance it on a spreadsheet, you're having to enact the same policy. And first off, I think the worst part about this policy is that you hire an employee, they instantly get 3 days of no call, no show. So imagine, after Super Bowl Sunday, you're a restaurant, you're any type of employer, your employees just decide to no call and no show. No doctor's note required. You can't ask where they were. They can just show up, on Thursday after missing Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday and say, oh yeah, those were my, 3 days of no call, no show that I'm allowed. And that's just, you can't run a business that way. And then if you try to fire the person because they, leave you hanging like that, then you're subject to litigation. So it's really unworkable for a restaurant owner. And then you also, another aspect that I think is so detrimental to our small businesses is you have to track your workers' accumulated sick time in 5-minute increments. I mean, again, not many people have the ability to track employee minutes by down to the 5-minute increment. Again, you're a multi-billion-dollar multinational corporation. You can put those types of protocols into place. It doesn't work for your average run-of-the-mill business in the state of Michigan.
Wow. Yeah, so just getting back to the tipped wage for a second to really try to just drive this point home. A lot of people wonder, I can understand from the small business point of view, but a lot of people wonder, why are the waitresses and waiters opposed to this policy. And tell me if I have this dynamic essentially correct. Restaurants are operating on razor thin profit margins. So when the tipped minimum wage goes up nearly 300%, like it's going in Michigan, from $5.99 to $15, then that has to be added on. The restaurant has to take that in extra labor costs. And the only way they can pass those costs on is by raising their menu prices, which is going to result in fewer families dining out and ultimately less tipped income for the waitress and waiters. Is that essentially what you're hearing from the people who are testifying against it?
Absolutely. So, restaurant workers really get hammered in this for a couple of different reasons, like you mentioned. The first off is going to be, additional costs and changing consumer habits, right? If you're, paying $25 for that hamburger, there's going to be fewer people who can afford that hamburger. And there'll be even fewer people who are able to both afford the hamburger and then give their 20% tip on top of that. So that means they're going to be, really hammered by, that cost, and the restaurant workers aren't going to get the 20% tip they would have gotten on the previous service. So there'll be less people dining out. The consumer habits of people will change. There's also going to be, I think, if this goes into effect, a shift away from table service. What you're going to see is more people go into the quick serve model of, ordering at the counter and then taking your meal back to your tables. And then you're just going to see fewer jobs in the industry as well. And that's really sad, because I really believe that the tip credit system that we have in the United States of America, that's American exceptionalism. That's the American dream. You work hard, you provide good service, you get rewarded for that. They don't have the tip credit in Europe, and they don't have the same level of incredible hospitality service that we have here in the United States of America. And it's a shame that there are those trying to get rid of it.
Yeah, I'll just give one warning sign from California, where I lived for several years. At one time, California was the mecca for middle-class dining out. There was it was the home of the diner, and it was a place where working-class folks would eat out. And now what's happening in California with all of these mandates and regulations and ridiculous minimum wage increases, along with the lawsuits, predatory lawsuits, is that now dining out full service is really something only the rich can do, or the upper middle class. And the left claims to talk about income inequality so much, but they don't recognize that the policies that they implement have the unintended consequences of making eating out something just a preserve just of the upper middle class. Is that something you're seeing in Michigan as well?
Absolutely. And I think it's ridiculous. If you're Gavin Newsom dining at the French Laundry, right, it probably doesn't matter, right? But for your average, restaurant here in the city of Midland, or, you look across our state, they're going to be hit really hard. And then, what I'd also add on top is these restaurant workers in our restaurant industry in the state of Michigan, or in a state like California, where you saw these severe, harsh lockdowns, restaurants were decimated, because they couldn't even open up. You had to socially distance, and in a way that didn't even make sense. And now you add on top putting into place what is a just unfair tip credit. It just shows you the disdain and the lack of understanding that there is from these coastal elites trying to take what is it doesn't affect them in their high towers, and they try to put it here on Main Street.
I hate to even ask the question, but what happens if this law, well, you know what, take us back a little bit into kind of the sausage making first. I guess two-part questions. One, how can the legislature, amend this? And if they are not able to amend it, what comes next? Is there any hope left for it, not to ultimately be signed?
Yeah. So the really bad ruling from the Supreme Court that is creating this February 21st deadline for Michigan small businesses and workers, there was one line in that I agreed with that said the current legislature can act, and the current legislature can amend the policy to be something that's more workable. And I would just like to, point to where this discussion has changed is, before the election and last year, when the Republicans were in the minority in the state house, we were told that everything was fine. They were just tuning out the restaurant workers, tuning out the small business owners. The Democrat majorities in Lansing were saying, everything's fine, don't worry, this is a good policy. Now what we've seen in the new year after the election, people said, "Oh yeah, gee, maybe we need to do something." The bills cleared out of the committee in the state house that I chaired without opposition, and the bill to amend sick time passed unanimously. And I think that shows the conversation is shifting. You have 4 hours of really personal testimony, really powerful stories from people across both of our peninsulas. I think that helps and shifts. The obstacle now is going to be probably I expect it'll pass out of the state house full chamber this week. Then the obstacle becomes the state Senate, which is controlled by the Democrats and our Democrat governor. And it's going to be incumbent on us to make sure that we're reaching out to every single medium, putting the pressure on and talking with people across our state about the impacts and the need to deliver.
Wow. Bill, where can people go to support your work and learn more about you and keep tabs on the fight?
Yeah, I would encourage everyone to follow me on Twitter. It's Schuette_Bill. Schuette is spelled SCHUETTE and then _Bill. And then follow Michigan House Republicans on social media, where that's our handle on Twitter, on Instagram, and that's where you're going to find out where our caucus is fighting and willing to fight. And I should say it's X, not Twitter. I'm still getting on to that the new platform.
We all are. Awesome. Well, Bill, thanks so much for taking the time to join us on Main Street Matters, and thank you all for taking the time to listen. Main Street Matters is part of the Salem Podcast Network, and new episodes debut every Wednesday and Friday. Please subscribe at salempodcastnetwork.com or wherever you get your podcasts, and we'll be back soon with another episode.